Hi everyone, you're watching the Virtual Amicus and I'm Jay Ludha. So today's topic for discussion would be on the aviation law, aircraft leasing and financing. Now, what do we mean by aviation law? Unfortunately, aviation law as a subject is not there in most of the curriculum that you see of law schools. So the students who are pursuing their law don't end up studying aviation law. Now we all know what these industry regulators are. What are the major players in civil aviation industry when it comes to the Indian aircraft carriers like Air India, Jet Airways, Kingfisher. We all are aware of these regulatory agencies. For example, the Director General of Civil Aviation, which is established by the Ministry of Civil Aviation and which is a main regulatory body that supervises civil aviation in India. But what are its functions and objectives? Now, we also are aware of Airports Authority of India, which was established by the Airports Authority of Act of 1994. But what are its functions again? We all are aware of these legislations and key legislations like Aircraft Act of 1934. We must have heard about them at some point, the aircraft rules. Now, where does one go for dispute resolution? Where does one go if there's a grievance, if there's any dispute involved? What are the forums? What are the statutory dispute resolution authorities that are there? Now, joining us today is a corporate lawyer with over 4 years of experience. We have with us Ms. Divisha Mehta, who is a corporate lawyer, and she's done a law from BA LLB honors from NLU Delhi. And currently, she is a senior legal associate at Interglobe Aviation Limited, Indigo, at Gurugram. So, thank you so much, Ms. Divisha Mehta, for joining us and for taking our time on a busy working day. Just to give you all a brief introduction about our amicus for today's session, Ms. Divisha Mehta. So she's done extensively and worked as in drafting, reviewing, and negotiating documentation for deliveries of over 15 Airbus A320, 330, 321 aircraft as a part of sale and leaseback transactions with Airbus SAS and over 5 owners and lessors. She's also drafted and negotiated lease deeds for the corporate office, the registered office, the training centers, the warehouses, and other offices of Indigo. She's provided legal support on the qualified institutional placement to raise funds up to 425 million US dollars. She's drafted legal opinions, legal notices, strategy notices. She's also been a part of the core team that is dealing with cases of unruly passengers who have breached safety protocols in relation to COVID-19. So you have to be very careful next time when you are on board Indigo Airways, because she's a part of the core team. And prior to that, she worked as an associate with Luthra and Luthra Partners Law Offices, currently known as Ellen & Partners Law Offices. And she's also pursued a course on international law on contemporary issues from London School of Economics and Political Science. So thank you so much, Ms. Divisha Mehta. This field is totally new for me, at least. So please enlighten us on aviation law, leasing, financing, and so for students who are watching this who don't have it as a subject, a mandatory subject to study, how should they approach it? So the stage is set. The floor is all yours. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I think what you said is extremely interesting, because definitely the fact that this is not taught in law schools is something that kind of scared me also when I was about to join, because I was like, I don't know anything about aviation law, aviation finance. Of course, like you said, we've heard of these words. We've heard of like DGCA, and we've heard like DGCA coming up with this, or the aircraft rules or the aircraft act, but we don't actually know what all it entails. And I think that was something that I was also coming in when I went in from law school. I was working at Luthra for 2 years before I joined Indigo. And I think essentially, and I think this is for all the students who are watching especially, I think the idea is that you need to know basic law. And I think after that, you kind of, get a grasp for whatever you're working on. So I think that is one lesson that I sort of learned. And I think that is a lesson that I wish I could tell myself when I was in fourth year or fifth year, eventually when I was, sort of, going to college, going to work, and then eventually, because I think a lot of training for work is on the job. So you have to be very, very clear that you have to have your basics in place. And after that, a lot of it happens on the job. So I think when it comes to, of course, I'm going to be talking about aviation financing and leasing in detail. But I think just to give a brief background of what it actually entails, it's basically more or less like any regular asset financing. So since this is an asset which is more heavy, it's like heavily capital intensive, which is why the players are a little bit more limited. And, there is a lot of technical specifications, which actually gets you in touch with interacting with a lot of engineers and a lot of technical folk. And I think I find that personally very, very exciting and interesting. And then, of course, there's this moment when, there's a transaction that's completely happened. It happened to me very recently. I had kind of worked on this aircraft delivery, and I was recently on that flight. And it just felt very, very cool that I had, worked on all the documentation and the negotiation for it. And now that I'm, the asset is finally in place and everybody is being able to use it. So I think that sense of achievement, I think, is definitely unparalleled. So now just to kind of give you a brief background of, like I said, aviation financing and leasing, and just to talk about largely what would be a transaction. So I think I'm just going to go through a life cycle of a transaction when it comes to aviation finance. And this also sort of comes from, a lot of it comes from regular asset financing. So I think what is to be remembered here is that a lot of it is, of course, going to be technical, but some of it comes from regular asset financing. So it's nothing which is completely off the, it's not something that's completely unheard of. So I think initially, like for any other transaction, this also kind of begins with the letter of intent, which two parties, which are usually the lessor or the lessee. And just to explain to you how this works is that a very few aviation companies, they actually own the aircraft. They own some aircraft, but largely most of the aircraft is on a sale and leaseback model. The model is called the sale and leaseback model. Essentially, what happens is that they have a deal with, so there are two large manufacturers of aircraft, especially for commercial aviation, which is Airbus and Boeing. So either with either of them, and they say that, we're going to buy XYZ number of planes from you. Then how it works is that you look for a lessor who will be able to buy that aircraft, and you're going to lease that aircraft from them. Why this is done is because, like I said, this is usually anyway a very, very capital intensive industry. You don't want to have that kind of assets or liabilities on your balance sheet, which is why you prefer to take it on lease, where you can also, it gives you flexibility to end the lease. But other than that, while a lot of these are very airtight, to be honest, so it's not as flexible as, taking, for instance, a car or a house where you can immediately return it. But at the same time, it gives you some flexibility. I think just this is it gives you a lot of freedom in order to how you want, or if you want to change your aircraft every 8 years, because there are more fuel efficient aircraft coming in the market. So these are a lot of reasons because of which it is preferred that they get these aircraft on sale and lease back. So what I have worked on is a lot of sale and leaseback transactions, and I just kind of wanted to go through that now. So the first is, of course, there's a letter of intent where you find this lessor. So the lessee is usually the aviation company. So in my case, it is Indigo. We look for a lessor who will be willing to buy that aircraft from Airbus and then is going to be able to lease it to us. So that's a transaction that we have with them, which is why we first do a letter of intent, which basically solidifies what the transaction is largely going to look like. Now, the LOI usually has a formal description of the contracting parties, the aircraft details, and the engine details. So now engines are also extremely important because, again, for engines, there are very few manufacturers, and you want to have, you have these certain ideas of what the engine, especially since I think I'm pretty sure that everybody's recently read about, there was this huge problem with like engines a couple of months, in fact, a couple of months ago itself. And that was eventually, the DGCA had directed that all of them who had that engine, including Indigo, including GoAir, had to replace all such engines which existed in their fleet. And so this also talks about the delivery location, the redelivery location. So what redelivery is the return of the aircraft. So that is also extremely important because when you're doing a lease for, say, typically 6 years or 8 years or 9 years, while we don't have that much visibility, since the asset is so large, you need to have enough visibility to say that, I'm going to have this for 6 years, 8 years, or 9 years, of course, which is extendable with the mutual consent of both the parties. But at the same time, it's very clear what the eventual situation of the asset is going to be after the asset it has to be redelivered. So that is something that you typically don't see that too much in regular asset financing, but in aircraft, this is something which definitely exists. Now, this is the first part, which is the LOI. The second is the reps and warranties, the representations and warranties, which become extremely important. Again, they're present in pretty much every asset finance, but here it is especially important because a lot of the representations and warranties which are provided are in relation to the health of the aircraft. And that has a lot of regulatory, that has a lot of regulatory oversight, a lot of regulatory overview. And at the same time, it's something that's extremely important for the safety of everybody who's going to be taking that aircraft. The reps and warranties are extremely essential in this particular case. And they also have this, so since this is a large amount of money, the lessors are also concerned about the financial health. Now, I think it's very well known that airline business generally has, and strong balance sheets are actually a rarity. In fact, I think Indigo was a large part of the selling point of Indigo has always been that we have a strong balance sheet, and that is across the world a bit of a rarity. So what happens is that they need a representation and warranty that you will continue to pay the rent for the aircraft, even if there is some sort of financial trouble. So that is a very important representation of warranty that is given in, or what happens if there's a default on the aircraft. So those are things that are kind of captured pretty much in the beginning. Then there are conditions precedent which are, created where there's an entire agreement with whoever the aircraft supplier is, whatever the payments will be, whatever the there's a commitment letter, there is security deposit. So security deposit is again extremely important because of the size of the asset. And all the letters of guarantee, the letters of comfort which a bank gives to say that these XYZ people have an account with us, and we are giving you comfort that they have the amount of money to be able to pay you in case there is any sort of a default, or in case there is any sort of a requirement for that. Now, so that is the reps and warranties, and the conditions precedent come after that. After which comes insurance. Now, insurance is again extremely critical when it comes to any sort of asset, but especially more so for aircraft, because there are a lot of people who will be directly involved in that aircraft, and a lot of consumer interaction is there, which is why the insurance becomes all the more important. Now, this is something very interesting that I learned, and I think this happens for all big assets, because I hadn't worked on an asset, so I did do some project finance back at my time in Luthra, but I hadn't actually worked in places where there was reinsurance. So there's an insurance, and then there's a reinsurer who insures the insurer. So there are many levels of insurance which happen, because obviously no entity is going to be able to take the entire risk for such a large asset. It happens in certain parts where there's an insurance, and there's a reinsurance of certain parts, and then there is maybe additional reinsurance for, suppose, the engine of a particular part of the aircraft that may require the same. So insurance is again extremely important. Then comes payment and security. So here, what is important is the security deposit is typically paid up well in advance, because you need to make sure that the lessor is comfortable with taking the asset, because at the end of the day, they are being sold the asset on, because you've told them that this aircraft manufacturer, whether it's Boeing or Airbus, is going to be selling the asset to you. So for you to give them more comfort, a security deposit is definitely a large part of it. And commitment fee is basically paid paid to the lessee, basically by the lessor, which is typically the lessee is going to be, in this case, Indigo, which is going to give it to lessor, whoever is going to own the aircraft. And that is essentially an idea to say that, we are committing it. We're going to be paying you this money, because you can't go ahead with the transaction because the risk is extremely high. So they need some sort of security, which is why a commitment fee is also paid, and that is typically paid in most aircraft cases. Now, after that, it comes to rent, etc., which is all paid after the time of the delivery. So these are basically some of the few things that happen pre-delivery. Now, coming to delivery, now what is important is the first is that there's a technical acceptance. So for that, there are technical acceptance flights. There are engineers are going to look at each and every little thing of the aircraft, whether it's something like the lavatory door to like a small knob. All of that is thoroughly checked, not just from like a regular perspective of having the asset in the right condition, but also from a safety perspective, because you have to be very, very thorough when you're getting an asset like an aircraft. So the technical aspects become extremely important. And then for that, there are a lot of reps and warranties which are provided. And I think that's where a lawyer's work comes in a lot, because here you're dealing with something that is going to be generally affecting a person's life, which is why you have to have the kind of airtight reps and warranties. You have to make sure that the technical documentation is completely and absolutely in place. And when it comes to then a delivery of a new aircraft, then then you have to do a lot of these checks, which are obviously done along with Airbus or Boeing. But when it comes to used aircraft, of course, again, it is done with the aircraft manufacturer, but all these things become all the more essential, because you have a lot of data to rely on in terms of how the aircraft was used previously, what was done with the aircraft, if it had any sort of minor incidents, major incidents, anything. So that again becomes extremely important even for lawyers to take note of it, because it gives you an idea of what are the potential problems that may arise and how you can deal with those problems. Now, the typical, there's a lot of things typically which need to be there. There has to be the power has to be great, the wheels and brakes have to be perfect. Then another thing is the repairs and maintenance, which is again extremely important. What happens is, with such a big aircraft, there are only certain people who can repair and maintain it as well. So you need to be sure that the repair and maintenance is taken care of, and this gives confidence to everybody, to the lessor in the transaction, to the lessee in the transaction, as well as to the aircraft manufacturer. If the repair and maintenance of it is sorted, because that has to be, it's usually a condition precedent to have completely everything in place when it comes to the machinery and when it comes to the repairs and maintenance of that. Now, the legal aspects of the delivery. So basically, it's usually very tight. So what happens is that, the technical acceptance of an aircraft typically starts maybe 4 or 5 days before the eventual TOT. The TOT is the transfer of title, and the technical acceptance is the TAC. It's usually called the TAC, which is the technical acceptance, and that's where like a lease is signed and the technical acceptance is done. And there's a lease acceptance certificate, there's a technical acceptance certificate to say that the lessor and the lessee are happy with the lease that is being currently in shape, and how the aircraft is going to be delivered. Now, this is done with observers from everywhere, And this is again something extremely interesting because I never realized how much work goes into like, so previously when I worked in project finance, and I'm just drawing this parallel here to make it clearer how this is extremely different from when there's another asset which is being, purchased or which is being financed. A lot of it was like, I worked a lot in oil and gas and solar power, etc. So the plants, of course, have technical conditions which are required, but nothing like an aircraft. I think the way that I've seen the technical aspects of it and the way that you need your reps and warranties, the way you need your covenants, the way you need your indemnities. So it really gives you a lot of perspective as to like, all the potential possible legal problems that may arise in any way, or financial problems or technical problems, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with all of it and you're trying to make sure that the aircraft is delivered to you in the best possible condition. And if there is anything that goes even slightly amiss, then you have enough recourse to be able to deal with it. So this is about it. Then it comes to, so of course, there's physical acceptance of the aircraft. Then there's a delivery schedule which is given to the lessor and the lessee and to the aircraft manufacturer. And then as per that, this happens. Now the delivery schedule is also extremely important because these things are very time critical, because it has to be delivered today, then it has to be delivered today, because the cost of parking an aircraft elsewhere or the cost of getting it to India, DGCA also, it's a highly regulated industry. So the DGCA also requires, and they release certain things, for instance, they say that, this is a special flight permit to bring it into India. Then they require you to have everything in place by that day. And if there's any sort of delay on that, then there is an entire, the commitment fee may change, etc. Because then the liquidated damages come into place, because this is an extremely time critical situation which everybody must sort of, be on their toes about. So the time of like aircraft delivery is usually very crazy for everybody who's involved, because it could be happening at any hour. There could be any changes at any point in time. So it's actually it's exciting, but it's also extremely tight. I think those couple of days are extremely intense when it comes to the work. Then, of course, there are maintenance checks, etc., which also are all documented. So I think one thing that I also it's extremely interesting when it comes here is that every little thing that happens is always documented, because of the size of the asset. And I think that is true, honestly, for all assets. I think this as lawyers is something that we sort of, understand eventually. We realize how important it is to document even the smallest things, to have everything in place, because eventually it is those things which get missed out on. So I think this as a side tip, which I kind of think that really helped me, was that you need to document little by little, everything that happens in any transaction, whether it's a matter, whether it's a case, everything should definitely always be documented. And that I kind of learned, like the precision of that, I learned when I started working on aircraft financing, because I realized, of course, it has to be documented, but in the amount of detail that it is documented is extremely helpful if there's any sort of a problem eventually. And then there is, of course, a demo flight, etc. There's inspections and the reports which are released. There's a certificate of acceptance, and then a transfer of title happens. Now, once the transfer of title happens, then the asset has been bought by the lessor and is now in the possession of the lessee, because the lessee is now going to be using that asset for whatever amount of time, whether it's 6 years or 8 years or whatever the entire situation is. So this is essentially like, and then of course there's registration, which is again a huge, since again, I told you it's a very, very heavily regulated industry. There's a lot of things when it comes to a registration. There are irrevocable power of attorneys, a bunch of things which are extremely airtight again, because another thing that is very interesting, and I think that I fortunately have not had an experience of, but I believe that is something that, we're definitely prepared for, is something that, if there's something that's wrong with the aircraft, and if you have to return it quicker, because then the amount of work that goes into it is extremely intense. And that is why you give certain documents to every lessor. You give them certain documents to say that, that if you need to come and repossess the aircraft in any manner or for any situation, then these are the documents that you have, which DGCA accepts. And this comes from the Cape Town Convention. So anybody who wants to actually know a lot about aviation law, I think Cape Town Convention is something that is a must read for everybody, because that will give you an entire detailed idea of how all the processes will happen, because that is internationally recognized. And that is something that all countries also. And I think it's important here for it to be internationally recognized, because it's very, very rare that you may have a lessor from India. Now I'm hoping, because in fact, in the new budget, if there's a lessor who is in the gift city, you get a lot of tax breaks, etc. And it is slowly coming up where you are seeing a lot of people in India, Indian financing companies also be interested. But at this point, it's actually not that common. as a result of which it's very important to be in compliance with all international standards. And this is something actually, interestingly enough, it's not just international standards when it comes to aircraft. I think what I also learned eventually was that it's India's, India is in its own place, and when it comes to like, dealing with lessors away, then they care a lot about like anti-bribery and like corruption and things like that. So those are things that you need to be in complete compliance of. You need to have a lot of reps and warranties which give them enough comfort, because those are extremely big crimes, and those are crimes that you need to be completely and absolutely aware of. So those are things that also you end up doing. So it's not just, very honestly, it's not just like asset financing, and it's not just like aircraft tools, but it's also like, of course, there's IPR involved. There is a lot of taxation. I think I developed like a lot of interest in taxation after I understood how complicated the tax structures of a lot of these things are. And I think for anybody who is interested in aviation law, I would definitely say that yes, there is definitely a lot of value in reading up on generally project finance, asset financing, but you should also definitely make it a point to know your tax very well. And I think that is something that I wish I had, I wish I had even a better background in, because I think it took me some time to get used to the tax conventions, which are especially internationally recognized, because we of course do a lot of, when we study also in law school, etc., we do a lot of direct taxation. We do a lot of Indian direct taxation largely. So I think for me to know the international taxation aspects, to know the various conventions, I think that was something that I particularly really, really enjoyed. And I definitely tell everybody that that is something that if you're interested, like if there are juniors, etc., who call me and say that, we want to do something in aviation, I tell them that it's very important that you also have your tax basics extremely clear. So this is largely how the entire process works. But I think when it comes to experience, I think the industry is extremely regulated, but at the same time, it's extremely interesting. I think that, if I talk about the practical, never a dull day. There is always something new happening, because there is so much changing. Of course, with COVID, it of course completely changed a lot of how we were looking at things. And travel being very, very part of it. In order to, we were still taking a lot of deliveries at that point in time. It was very unclear. It is very unclear what mission generally would be, and that one is picking up now, and that's what we can hope. But it's a very, very fast moving industry with a lot of different aspects to it. And I think that is what kind of, and I think when I was told to do the session, I know that there was one part of it where I wanted to talk about the aviation financing, the leasing aspect of it, but there's also part of it which I wanted to talk about my own experience in it. And I think when I entered the field, I actually didn't know very much about it. I had some experience, like I said, in project finance. And I had, I particularly just enjoyed reading up on aviation. Aircraft that generally, it's something that had always, I was always enthused by the idea of how this works and how this works, how that works and how this is going to happen. So when I actually joined, to be very honest, I didn't have too much of an idea of aviation law. And I think now that over a period of time, I've been developing a greater understanding of it. And I think it's given me a lot of perspective and a lot of background as to what all can be there, and what small aspects and small little things and the value that small little things hold. So I think that's definitely something that I have personally experienced. I think other than that, when I talk about my own personal experience, I think I learned a lot of things over the last couple of years, which I think are more important than anything else. I mean, I genuinely am a believer that most jobs that you do, you will be able to get a grasp of it because you will work hard at it. And I think the only way to learn those things is by working, and is by actually practically looking at a lot of things. And I think now, when I look back at my own education, I wish I'd done a lot more of the practical stuff. I mean, of course, we had those courses on drafting and pleading and convincing, but I wish I'd like actually done a lot of it on my own as well, because that is what gives you a sense of what you're actually looking at. It's one thing to look at an act and to understand the act. It's one thing to actually apply it in real life. And that is something which is a completely different ballgame. And I think that is also applicable for cars, the civil aviation requirements. So there's a card for pretty much everything. If you want to, anything which has to do with like civil aviation, which has to do with commercial flying, a lot of it is dependent on the car. And I personally, I can't say that I've read the car in its entirety. I think I read the car as and when new things come up, whether it's about airworthiness, whether it's about, flight permits, whether it's about even wheelchair passengers, whether it's about food being served on board. All of that is something that I also personally learn every single day. But I think of the car is something which is like the Bible when you're working in any sort of aviation. If you're interested in aviation, I think car is something that you should really know very well, and you should keep learning and keep updating yourself, because there's a new version, it constantly updates. So it gives you a lot of perspective on what you should, what is changing and why it's changing. And that happens with like tax, etc. as well. So even when, like I said, like, connecting to what I just said previously, I think when it comes to civil aviation, I think if you have your basics clear, and if you're familiar with the car, etc., with the Cape Town Convention, those are the things that I genuinely think that, they should, in fact, I personally believe that it should be a part of your curriculum. Not just this, but also how you deal with different matters which come in, when different things, different small things. And I think something that, again, I'd like to add here, because that is a different experience that I've had as an in-house lawyer vis-a-vis I've had as a transaction lawyer previously, or when I worked with a dispute resolution associate back in a law firm. I think what I've realized now is that a lot of the work is, while it's, some of the matters may be very, very small, but they require quick decision making. And I think that that is a skill that you develop over a period of time. I'm still developing it, where you look at, what is required, what is not required, and then you go on and you look at it in a very, very business perspective. I think what is, a lot of times, a lot of people don't want to visit lawyers because they feel like, it's going to build you into it's going to make you, go into a legal quagmire and you won't know which way to go. I think the idea is that you have to be very business friendly as well. And I think that is what working in a company, specifically an aviation company in my case, but generally working in a company is also given me, where I've gotten a lot of perspective on what is the problem solving aspect of things. Because of course there is one aspect of it which is about getting your work right. And if we would want, and as lawyers, I think we feel it every day, when we look at a draft, we can think of 100 different problems with it, but we also have to be business friendly when we're doing a lot of things. And I think this is something that aviation finance also taught me a lot, because since finance is extremely important and essential to how the entire operations of the company run. And so it gives you a lot of perspective on what you should do when it comes to, different, and it can be very small problems. I mean, I'm also part of the unruly passenger situation, and there it's very different, because I think that this particular car which deals with unruly passengers, so this one is particularly talks about about people who are not wearing their masks on board. And we will not realize how that problem is actually fairly common, because it surprises me every day. And then there are, you need to take calls on how you need to approach it. It needs to go to an internal committee. It then after that needs to, then there's a decision that you've taken, or like there's a decision that comes out of it. The person can appeal that decision when it comes to the DGCA. And there are also different aspects when it comes to tariff. And I'm generally giving a background of aviation law because I think this is extremely essential for anybody who's interested in it. I think when it comes to tariffs, there is the Airport Economic Regulatory Authority, the ERA. So ERA is what decides the tariff. Now, what goes in behind deciding the tariff? What is essential for the company? What is the amount of money that is, necessary for a particular thing? What is the amount of money that you may think is not necessary? So those are all business decisions, and a lot of the legal work in any company, and especially in an aviation company, also has to do with a lot of understanding the commercials. So I think the commercials give you a good idea what your operations team wants, and when you do that, and that could be your client, what your client wants, what your operational teams want, because that eventually then gives you a greater way of being able to negotiate an agreement to get exactly what you want. So I think a lot of, whether it's aircraft financing or leasing, whether it's aviation law in general, or whether it's law in general, I believe, I think a lot of it comes from understanding your client's position and not dealing with it just as a lawyer, and also dealing with it from a business perspective, where you're able to understand what the business behind it is and how you can help the business to grow, as opposed to, creating a roadblock, which may be at that point in time unnecessary because it may not achieve the results that you want to anyway. So that is kind of all. I think it's essentially, I think while it's very important, and while, aviation finance is definitely something which is very important, I think a lot of focus that I believe, especially for the students here, and I think this is just something that I'd like to say, a lot of focus for all the students should be on reading up as much as they can about absolutely everything, and never close themselves off to any idea, any field of law, because that is the only thing that is eventually going to work. When you're going to be at work, you're not going to be working on one particular kind of law. You'll be working on several different kinds of law. You will be working on problems from things that you never even imagined. And that's where it helps to have an idea of absolutely everything. So I think it's very important that is a message that I would definitely like to tell anybody who's studying law at this point.
Thank you so much there, Ms. Mehta, for your valuable insight on a subject that is unfortunately not taught, in law schools. I think perhaps this is what the virtual amicus is all about, where brilliant speakers come, brilliant lawyers come, they give their valuable insights, they share their experiences, they share the journeys, the lessons that they've learned. So thank you so much once again. So two quick questions then. I hope you have the time.
Sure.
Uh, so we'll
Sure,
quickly
sure, sure.
proceed with the questions. Number one, when did you first realize your passion or identify your passion in aviation law, and which internship or that one academic course proved to be the turning point in your career that landed or helped you in the field that you're in today?
So, very honestly, I think I only realized my passion for aviation law after I started doing it, to be very honest. But I think that one thing that I definitely, and of course, I also spoke about, I think my experience in project finance definitely helped me. But I think one course that I go back to all the time, even today, is specifically contract law. I think that is the Bible for absolutely everything that you want to do, because eventually it all comes down to how your contract is. And I think that is something that I would tell all students to be extremely, I know that it comes pretty much early actually in our law school careers, and we at that point in time we are not that inclined to understand it more practically. But I think every single day, and I think I can't say that just for the last 2 years. I think for the last 4 years, every single day I have had a concern or an issue which has been solved or at least has been answered by the Contract Act. So I think contract law is something that we should definitely focus more on law schools. I think that is something that is definitely available everywhere, and I think that is something that eventually, for a lot of corporate work or a lot of commercial work, is eventually the Bible for what you do eventually.
Thank you so much there. So to all the viewers who are watching, it is the law of contracts that is your Bible. So, one has to be very serious and one has to pursue it to be able to understand, gauge, and identify your passion, especially in aviation law. Now, coming to our next question, Ms. Mehta, any particular literature or any student edition, any book, any moot court competition in this field or area that you wish to recommend to law students who are watching this in absentia of aviation law as a mandatory subject in a law school?
So I definitely would say that, a lot of it is, and I think barracks are extremely essential. I think, like I already mentioned, I think the car is something that people should definitely read if they're interested in aviation. The Cape Town Convention, those are definitely things. There are books which are on aircraft leasing in India as well. There is LexisNexis, etc. have books which are also particularly, they're very particular and specific to it. So I think initially what I would recommend would be to, of course, have your contracts, etc., contract law clear. Not just Indian contract law, but I would also recommend, looking at a lot of contract law from especially the UK or from Ireland or from the United States, Australia. So those have some extremely interesting cases which answer a lot of questions on a day-to-day basis. So I think I would start with contract law, after which I would say that you look at the BEAR Act, whether you look at the aircraft rules, whether you look at the aircraft act, you look at, the different, there's a BCAS, which is the Bureau of Civil Aviation Safety. So those are also things that, they have BEAR Acts of their own. They're quite interesting. Tax, again, is something that I said that, this is something that you should focus on. And after that, I would say that once you have done all of this, then there are books on aircraft leasing and financing, which are very, very fairly commonly available on Amazon, etc., which is on LexisNexis and stuff. Those will give you a more nuanced understanding. Of course, I think it's better to start from the beginning with a more basic understanding. So by the time you reach the nuanced understanding, you're very clear on what you have been looking at. And by the time you do the nuanced understanding, you actually understand the smallest concepts because your basics are just that clear. So I think eventually it all, to me personally, and I think I recommend this to all law schools, I think law students, is that eventually what really matters is how clear your basics are, because once your basics are clear, you will have a good idea of whatever you're doing and you'll be able to pick up absolutely anything that life throws at you in that sense, in any particular field, whether it's to do litigation, whether it's to do corporate law, whether it's to work in a company. Either way, I think it's very important to have your basics clear, which is why I think that is what I recommend the first and foremost. When you spoke about also about courses, and there are a bunch of ITA, it has a bunch of courses which are actually interesting. There are also, it may be worth a shot to actually look at a lot of aviation law. How to explain it? It's more like aviation law, not aviation law specific, but like transport and travel, like transport law, or which also deals with ships and shipping law and maritime law. All of those concepts are also extremely, very, very relevant. And those, surprisingly enough, actually, there are electives which come in maritime law and shipping law, which come even in law school. So I think I would recommend that those are also taken in if there is a particular interest in aviation law. And other than that, there are obviously lots of books to refer to at all points.
Yes, absolutely. So to all the viewers who are watching this, please understand one thing. It is very important. Your academics should be your first priority. Only when you study hard and you keep academics as your first priority, you will understand concepts better. And only when your concepts and your fundamentals are strong, you'll be able to gauge, identify what you're passionate about, what you love doing, something that you can do at probably 3 or 4 in the morning. So it is very important. Number two, it might come not as a mandatory subject, but in the form of an elective, like a maritime law or law of contracts. So it is very important to study these subjects properly in detail and find your mentor in your professor if possible. So, and one last question on a lighter note, you landed up in aviation law by accident or by design?
By accident, actually. I just had heard very good things about the aviation team, about the legal team Indigo. And it wasn't a plan. I had no plans of actually joining it. But actually, when I met some people on the team, and I think this is something that I think is important as a life lesson also. I think when you're working with people that you enjoy working with, I think work also becomes a lot more interesting and exciting. And this is something that I have learned personally from this entire experience, is that it's important, of course, to do work that you love, but it's also important to work with people who inspire you, you learn a lot from. Because like you said, like mentors are extremely important because it gives you a lot of sense of what is supposed to be done at what point in time, and you're never scared to do it. And I think if you're going to be in that cycle, you're definitely going to do better in whatever that you do. So that is it was by chance, but I'm honestly very glad, and I can't imagine working in another industry now, to be honest.
So we all know now why Indigo is doing so well, exceedingly well. Why is it number one in the domestic market? Because they have lawyers like you working for them. So on that note,
That's not true, but
yeah.
No, but I would definitely like to, before we wrap up, I think this is great that you're doing this. I think it's extremely interesting. And I wish I had something like this when I was back in law school to really, refer to and to be able to understand how people who are actually practicing the profession, because it's one thing to, deal with people who are academicians. It's one thing to deal with people who are practicing the profession in any manner. And it just opens up your horizon so much, because I think when we're graduating from law school, it's very clear that you're either going to be working in a law firm or you're going to be litigating. I think that's the idea that's in everybody's head, that this is what you're going to do. And then when they ask you, what do you want to do in that? You say, I'm going to do M&A, PE, because that's what you know of corporate law. And when it comes to litigation, it's, I want to do civil litigation, I want to do criminal litigation. And eventually you realize that none of this is actually how the world works. So I think I wish I had something like this to be able to refer to at that point in time, to be able to understand how much more there is to it than I could at that point in time fathom.
Well, that's precisely the reason why I started this, because we never had a mentor in law school to tell us, to guide us. There are so many new fields that have opened up now. It's not just about litigation or the corporate transactional work that people are doing. And number two, because we are all in the middle of a pandemic, COVID-19 is one big reason why physical accessibility to professors, there's a lot of travel and movement restrictions that we've seen because of lockdowns that have been imposed both by state and central governments. So it was so important for these law students, who suffered in some way or the other, who've never been to even a campus till now because of the virtual classes that they're enrolled in. So I hope that this effort would pay, and we get lawyers like you, passionate and ready to share their valuable insights and experiences. So thank you so much, Ms. Divisha Mehta, once again for a session. And I'm sure our viewers, all the law students, lawyers who are watching this will immensely benefit from this segment. Feel free to write to us on any of the queries or any of the fundamentals or concepts. We'll be more than happy to share with our speaker, our amicus for today's session, Ms. Divisha Mehta, or you can write to her directly, or whatever works for you, whatever suits you. So thank you so much once again. Thank you so much, everybody. Stay tuned. Next episode is on its way. Please like, share, and subscribe my channel. And stay tuned. Next episode is on its way. So it's goodbye for now. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Divisha Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you.